Habari gani, karibuni, asanteni. Thank you for being with us here. Welcome to Kumbukeni. Again, my name is Nduku. And just to introduce myself today, I just wanted to say something quickly. There comes a time where one must decide to continue suffering or do something to stop the suffering. I have chosen to do something about it. And I do not look at suffering in the individual sense. My suffering is of the collective, the whole global African community. So for me, I'm just saying, because we know now that to fight for African freedom is to be criminal under this oppressive system. If they do take me out, you must all continue the work. We cannot let this continue being the fate of our African people. My brothers, Adesoji and Allimadi.
Yes, Adesoji here from the belly of the beast, the mother of all imperialists. As you would say, yes, Kudedewoyi, and that's in my mother tongue, and they would say, Afojuso, Afinuso, Aniagbo, which is sometimes we have to say it with all our bodies, for all our orifices, for the world to hear what it is we intend to say. And so with that, I'll pass the mic over to Brother Milton. Good evening, everyone, again.
And Kiswahili is karibuni, right? Welcome,
Ndio.
welcome, comrades from all over the world, particularly all comrades engaged in the good struggle. One thing that we can always take comfort in knowing that our beloved continent is blessed with some of the best and dynamic human beings, blessed with abundant land, with water, with sun, with fertile soil, with mineral and natural resources.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was not by accident. And it's not by accident that that's where all human beings hail from. Our task, of course, is to manage the resources and the environment and to defeat greed.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, ultimately, capitalism is about greed, about appropriating resources for a minority of human beings, of the human population. And that is the challenge. And that's a simple way to see it. Nothing fancy about it. We've all met and we know greedy people.
Mm-hmm.
We have even greedy family members, right? People who want to appropriate disproportionate parts of resources for themselves.
Mm.
And that's how to view capitalism. And if you see it that way, then you see that you also have a stake in being a part of this resistance. So when we speak here, we are hoping to educate people and give them the mental framework for them to analyze, the things we see on a regular basis and to choose to join the resistance. And that's what we do. And that's why we speak truth to power on our weekly podcast. We call it our global university. So as always, I'm excited to be with my comrades here from New York City, Milton, Allimadi. Karibuni again.
You look very excited, Brother Allimadi.
No, we are dealing
I
with
like the shirt as always
sometimes,
representing that African fashion. I like it. So we're going to be talking about the African Union today and so much more around it. And to start our conversation, I will hand it over to our historian, Adesoji. Please do let us know about the African Union.
Historian, there is not a historian in the house.
I know, but even he has selected you as the historian.
So,
and by the way, who gives the endorsement to who a historian is, right? I mean, most of the historians in the official academy are in fact part of the problem.
Yeah.
Look at the European historical establishment.
Mm-hmm.
It took Basil Davidson, right, who was
A
not
white man.
not a part of the academy,
Mm.
to go to Africa and tell the Europeans who are part of the academy that you are not teaching truth to power. So you're as much a historian as any historian, brother. The floor is yours.
Okay, so you pull on the strings of Basil Davison when someone, I believe, wrote the book The White Man's Burden. He corrected it in his book of essays when he said, actually, it's the black man's burden. So, yes, the Organization of African Unity that would then become the African Unity in 2002 was first had their inaugural meeting May 25, 1963. And the recently independent nations came together, 33 in number at the time, including the host, Emperor Haile Selassie, who called the meeting in May of 1963.
Yes.
Now, what was unique about that meeting was, prior to them coming to the meeting, there's already been a schism in the African continent in terms of ideology, of approach, of how to move the continent forward. By that, I mean you had the Monrovia group and the Casablanca group. Without going, too deep into what the members are, but the basic ideology or how you could tell them apart was that the Monrovia group wanted, a softly approach of trying to excise the imperialists from the continent, while the Casablanca group wanted to just, have the straight courts, and let's get on with it. So from that meeting, and I've put a couple of resources in the chat. One there that will give you an insight into their thinking is actually titled African Voice Successes. African Voices, that's 1963 to 2013. It's about 50 years of their speeches. So it gives you an idea of what they talked about in the first meeting and what they subsequently talked about when they marked 50 years. And you can see, going through that book, it's also funny that the word challenges come up 110 times in there. And if you look at the first part of the book where the speeches are, the challenges are saying what they faced. In 2013, those challenges that should have become opportunities still remain challenges. And so, why is that the case? Well, a host of reasons, really. They came away from that meeting deciding that the best way to move the continent forward was to empower the regional bodies. Some of those regional bodies, well, the ones in East Africa came and went. Basically, sometimes if they're lucky, they will survive 2 years. Beyond that, they just fizzled out. West Africa will only come into its own foreground in 1975, which is a shock, because the first country that got independence on that side of the world was actually Ghana, and got its independence in 1957. And so you wonder, if majority of the countries there got their independence in 1960, why did it have to take them 15 years for them to then put their act together and decide, you know what, it's time to, come together? So the problem in that sense was also the fact that the imperialists never left. In the case of West Africa, the constant, din of the tricolor that was blowing in the wind in there disturbed any idea of unity. In fact, when they decided they wanted to come together, they did up to a point, and everything stopped. And so, if you then extrapolate that to the greater continent, then you then have the Arab League, who were also fomenting, pulling the strings of the guys in the northern sphere of the continent, saying, why are you looking to sub-Saharan Africa? Why not look to the Arab League? And so with the removal of the guys like Gamel Nasser, Ben Bella in Algeria, King Hassan of Morocco toned down his rhetoric when the king was removed in Libya, the thought was the guy who replaced him would follow suit with the Arab League, but he would turn coat and then look to sub-Saharan Africa. So you had all these machinations. You had the Ian Smith government in Rhodesia. That became a problem. And so everybody has been pulling the Organization of African Unity in all sorts of directions. So it's no surprise that we're now looking at that body that's now become the AU to say, why has it failed? So the conversation we're going to have today is looking into the nitty-gritty of why it has failed and, possibly bring up some ideas as to how to move forward. So over to you guys.
So that was a great one. I don't know if you wanted to say something, Allimadi.
I want to pick up on where the comrade left in terms of he raised one of the questions, why did it fail?
Mm-hmm.
I think it failed primarily because of the United States. The United States was very fearful of the United States of Africa.
Mm.
And we can give examples of how the United States, of course, because the United States is a country that is managed and directed by greed, by capital.
Mm.
The people who are elected to administer the government of the United States are all capitalists and all imperialists, as the late Julius Nyerere of Tanzania once said, when in response to a question, he said the world would be a much better place if the US had an opposition party. And then the journalist said, what do you mean? We have Democrats and Republicans. He said, that's the problem. They're both capitalists and they're both imperialists. So you don't have an authentic opposition party. And that actually is the problem,
Mm-hmm.
because the US does not have an authentic opposition party. We saw how the US became militarily involved. Think about it, to the extent that you're sending and working with people that are opposing revolution in another country, the Soviet Union, right? When the Soviet Union was being formed, they actually intervened and helped to intervene militarily to change the direction of history, because they were fearful of a united, federated Soviet Union with different ideological policy, right? It has to be the same unipolar policy. The US did the same thing. People's Republic of China supported Chiang Kai-shek against Mao Zedong, supported Taiwan and still supports Taiwan, and still has this nonsense talk about willing to go to war on behalf of Taiwan against China, when in fact Taiwan is part of China.
Mm-hmm.
So the United States, even though did not militarily go all out the way it did against the Soviet Union was being formed, against People's Republic of China, it in its own way did the same thing by undermining Kwame Nkrumah, who was, of course, the chief advocate of the United States of Africa.
Yeah.
And ultimately used the Ghanaian military and police forces to overthrow Kwame Nkrumah in 1966. But Nkrumah had been monitored from very early, because as you know, Nkrumah went to Lincoln University.
United States.
So if you go to the State Department, and I was trying to, as I said, when we were planning this discussion, I would try to research the U.S. role in opposing the United States of Africa.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go to the website, the historical website of the State Department, you find the memos about Nkrumah as early as 1951, when he came to the U.S. to address Lincoln University, his alma mater. So the memo was saying, even though at that time, I think he was leader of government business, because Ghana was not yet formally independent. So he was handling some affairs except foreign affairs, except defense and other critical, like the Treasury Department, finance. Key ministries were still in the British colonial hand. So the memo was saying he's going to be the effective power eventually.
Mm-hmm.
So even though we can't officially have him as a guest, let's have an unofficial luncheon with him. So at that time, they designated the Assistant Secretary of State to host a luncheon for Nkrumah, and he did. That's 1951. 1953, there's another memo from the U.S. consul in Ghana, saying Nkrumah, and this is still before Ghana's independence, is organizing a, quote, Pan-African meeting.
Yep.
And this information was given to the U.S. by Ghana's Ministry of Defense, which at that time was still being handled by the British. So they're already coordinating, even before independence, how to control Nkrumah. And they said in this meeting is going to invite people like Awolowo from Nigeria, Azikiwe from Nigeria, Margai from Sierra Leone, Olympus, Sylvanus from what was that?
Togo, yeah.
Later became Togo, right? So this is 1953. 1958, there's another memo. And that, of course, remember
very busy.
That year was when Nkrumah hosted the meeting of nationalist organizations in different African countries in May 1958. There's a memo on that saying we have to monitor this carefully. Another memo the same year in 58, because remember in September, he had that meeting of the independent African countries at that time. I think there were about maybe 9 or 11 of them only. That's still 1958. Another memo is from 65.
These oppressors, like...
Yes, absolutely. By 1965, they were completely ready to get rid of Nkrumah. And that memo is saying Nkrumah is basically like a firebrand. So he needs to be removed because now he's influencing neighboring countries, including Nigeria.
And we Africans allowed it. Go on, Allimadi.
Yes, we allowed it.
Yes, we did.
And they said in that memo, said, even though the U.S. had committed to support the Volta River project and the World Bank had approved the loan, the money should not be dispersed. The money should be frozen, essentially. Delay disbursement. Don't reject it because you already approved the loan, but just don't hand over the money. And then as a result of that, what will happen? The Ghanaian economy will tank, and then civil society in Ghana will become hostile to Nkrumah. There will be protests and demonstrations, and then the military would use that that opportunity to intervene and overthrow Nkrumah. That memo was 1965. 1966, Nkrumah was overthrown. So there was a hostile concerted effort by the United States to undermine Nkrumah and his vision for United States of Africa. So ultimately, even though, of course, we must also blame the African leaders. As you broke down, they came into the Monrovia and Casablanca group, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge how much pressure the United States was putting on all the Africans who were interested in forming a United States of Africa.
Yeah, but we get pressure all the time, but how long are we going to sit under pressure while suffering? We must do something about that, right?
I agree with
and
you.
I'm glad you mentioned...
cannot excuse the pressure. I agree with
you. No more. We cannot do that. And I'm glad you brought in Nyerere and the fact that he said there's no opposition to the United States. But today, I am happy to say that there is opposition to the United States in the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru Movement. And its chairman, Omali Yeshitela, says, and it goes back to what you were just saying, Allimadi, that the African Union was created on May 25th, 1963 in Addis Ababa as part of an effort to circumvent efforts by Kwame Nkrumah to build a single union of African states. And instead, they codified the colonial borders that were created by Europe in 1845. So this is the Monrovia group winning over the Casablanca group and deciding to build a system for Africa that is ingrained in colonial structure, which is why we're still here talking about Africa not being free, which is why we have debt, taxes going out of control in Africa and affecting other areas of the globe, which is why they claim that we have a debt that they began with. So we as people with brains, we as people who have love for us, have to get up and do something. We cannot continue to saying, oh, I have a job, oh, I'm taking care of my child, oh, I have a house, oh, what if, while still existing in a state of oppression.
No, I think the young people in Africa are finally awoken up. The young people who are coming out in the streets, they're supporting the military takeovers. It's not because they like militarism. It's not because they have any particular love for the military. In fact, in Mali, part of the reason why Assimi Goïta adopted a progressive approach was because of the civilians.
Mm-hmm.
Because number one, he hijacked the coup. They hijacked the revolution, rather. At the time of the first coup in Mali, 2020, let's not forget what
He
was
came
going
back.
on.
Yeah.
There were protests on the streets every day by students, trade unions, professionals, all coming out to the streets. They were opposing the civilian government at that time, which was failing to deliver, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's when the military, which of course was also under a lot of stress, fighting the so-called jihadis, who were, by the way, empowered by France's destruction of Libya in 2011, giving them access to all these weapons. They're virtually defeating all the official armed forces in most of the West African countries because they have more sophisticated weapons. So the military intervened on personal and selfish level. But then the civilians did not stop protests. They kept pressing the military. In fact, they were insisting that the military restore power to the civilians, not the civilian president who they had been fighting, but the new civil society organizations that were emerging. It was only then that Assimi Goïta adopted a progressive outlook,
Yeah.
drew the line against France, drew the line against French exploitation of the country's resources. And that narrative is now being repeated by all the subsequent coup leaders.
Yep.
Same thing in Burkina Faso. Burkina Faso, there were two coups, remember? One in January 2022. And that guy, in fact, he started sending out feelers to
Blaise Compaoré,
the murderer of
Thomas Sankara.
Thomas Sankara. So even other junior officers said, no, this is not why we overthrew the government for. So they got rid of him. They had a second coup in Burkina Faso. And they started speaking the same language that Goïta was speaking in Mali. And now the same thing with Niger. The people, in fact, the presidential guard leader is the one who overthrew President Bazoum. And there's indication they had their own personal beef.
Yep.
But after he got rid of Bazoum, who came out in the streets? All the young
people. Exactly. So they hijacked.
Coming out not because they support him, but they're hoping that he will now also help them end French exploitation of their resources. And so he also had no choice but to adopt progressive language, because that's the only way he's going to survive anyway. And
temporarily.
Temporarily. And the
temporarily.
one in I think this time, if they consolidate, they can survive, because they've realized that they have to work together.
As long as you're using progressive language, which means you're accommodating the colonial powers,
not
it is
progressive
temporary.
language. They're bringing young people on the streets.
Okay.
So, for example, in Niger, when France went to ECOWAS and say, invade within a week if they don't restore Bazoum, Mali, Burkina Faso said, if you invade, we are also going to be a part of this fight. This is the first time that African countries are showing that kind of solidarity. So long as young people are insisting and coming out on the streets, I think they'll keep pushing them in the same direction. In Senegal, what happened? In Senegal, they arrested the opposition leader because he also has captured the imagination of the young people. I don't think that will survive. I think he'll be forced to release him, and I think that guy will probably win the presidency in Senegal. So I think there's a hopeful moment in Africa right now to go back to the discussion of the 1960s in terms of a borderless Africa, United States of Africa. And of course, you must know the enemy is also working 24/7 at the same time.
Which means we have to get better at what we're doing. Yeah. My question, and I hear you and I appreciate what Africa is doing right now, and it actually gives me hope, is what are we doing about it? We can celebrate what Africa is doing, but what are we doing about it? Because this has to be an all fronts type of solution, because that's how they operate. They are literally in our continent, every single space of our continent. And they started a long time ago with the CIA being embedded in Africa. So we can't just leave this to the continent and the youth. It has to be the continent, the youth, the elderly, the middle-aged, all of us, whatever we can do to get in this fight and fight.
Comrade Adesoji, your thoughts? I think we are providing this type of platform which offers guidance to young people. I think that's the best thing we can do. We can come up with that. For example, we're having a conversation today about the inadequacy of the African Union. And hopefully in the course of today's conversation, we're going to propose what we think are some of the solutions that we need to undertake.
There's an age-old saying, which is the first point of resistance is acknowledging that you have a problem. So what you're doing here by this conversation is acknowledging you have a problem. When you then have that problem, the next thing you do is understand what the problem is. There is no one solution to the problem. There's going to be multiple solutions. It might not be. I'll give you an example. When Patrice Lumumba was killed, it was the Americans wanting to take him out. But the Americans didn't know that the Belgians too wanted to take him out. So if you notice, the attempt on his life were made by the CIA were planning, but the Belgians seized the opportunity. So it's not so much as you coming up, because if you come up with one solution, what would then happen is people will study said solution and then neuter it. And that's the end. When, what's his name? Kwame Nkrumah, when he proposed the United States of Africa, he knew most of the people were not ready. But he was banking on the fact that if the people in the streets agitated in love and they had that political consciousness, and they did, right? They did. They would eventually have to understand that, you know what? We're going to use what we have to get what we want. He even told Patrice Lumumba that you need to be much more strategic. In his book, which I put in the chat there, in the Challenge of the Congo, he says one of the problems that allowed Patrice to be captured was the fact that he never stood firm on one position. He was dilly-dallying. And when you're dilly-dallying and you're not strategic enough, because every time he wrote to Nkrumah, before the letter got to Nkrumah, he had already written another letter. So Nkrumah is having to answer 2 letters almost simultaneously from the same guy. The phones were touchy and what have you. And so you're having to deal with, oh, he's just heard this. Oh, he's just heard that. So the question is, you need to know that, yes, these guys out there they're planning. The French are in French, I used to use, are in quote unquote,
borders.
Francophrique, still playing around. The latest being the removal of the accreditation of the ambassador in Niger and him refusing to leave. So the question then lies is, what is sovereignty? Do you have sovereignty? If you have sovereignty and you've removed, so one, you're playing with the notion of the rules. You're still playing by their rules.
Exactly.
So when I say you're playing by their rules, what language are you going to speak? If you want to speak to someone in Nigeria today, you don't have commonality of language. You don't have commonality of currency. You don't have commonality of economy. You barely produce anything. So where are you going to start from? All of these things are incremental. We can go out today and start the scattergun approach. It won't get us anywhere. We'll be, I gave the inference of the speeches they gave. Mm-hmm. They were talking about challenges in 1963. In 2013, they were still talking about the same challenges.
And we're still talking about them. Mm-hmm.
Why were they talking about the same challenges? Because they refused to study what their adversaries were doing to them. And I think that is the problem. We don't study who our adversaries are. It's America. But what is America doing to you? How is America getting to you? How is France getting to you? How is Britain getting to you? How is Germany getting into the fray? What is Germany's interest? You need to study all of them. And again, when I say we need to study, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, the man has given us the blueprint. So talking about agitating in the street is, well, we could make noise. That's noise. But you need to be strategic. So ECOWAS, that should be the vehicle for that strategy, has been neutered. We still have a country that is still a colony of another African colony. How many people know that? Western Sahara is essentially a colony of Morocco. Haiti should be a member, even if at arm's length, of the African Union, but it's not.
Again, because of the foundation, the structures, and I'm glad you're saying this.
No, they're there. No, they were there before, but
because of the foundation and structure of the African Union, that it's based on colonial powers. That whoever controls them.
Haiti had observer status, but it was removed.
I am saying the reason why Haiti is not included in the African Union, and the reason why the African Union rejected adding them, is because the person that makes decisions for the African Union is not in the interest of uniting Africa. Because the foundation is based on colonial systems.
Again, it goes to what Thomas Sankara said. He who feeds you controls you.
Exactly.
66% of the AU's budget comes from the European Union.
Thank you for mentioning that.
And so, majority of the peacekeeping efforts in Africa are underwritten by the European Union. So let us sink in for a moment. So if the European Union does not want peace in Africa, it's not going to pay for it. And you are not going to get it.
And as you say that, Adesoji, quickly, I want to jump on that and add that the other percentage is paid for by the partners of the AU. And these partners, I'll quickly name them, are the United Nations, the African League of Arab States, Africa-South America Cooperation Forum, Africa Union Commission, United States of America, High-Level Dialogue, China-Africa Cooperation Forum, Tokyo International Conference on African Development, Africa-India Partnership, Africa-Turkey Partnership, Africa-Korea. Did you hear me mention Africa Union anything?
So in other words, you're saying there's no such thing as an African Union?
No.
This reminds me of Cabral. Cabral was a real intellectual, Pan-African revolutionist. Cabral belonged in the academy, could have been a brilliant professor anywhere in the world. But of course, he was called to arms because he wanted to liberate his country from Portuguese, white colonial rule. Cabral was offered fighting men to help him in the liberation struggle by Cuba. And Cabral said, no, thank you. Said, I love you, comrade, brother Fidel Castro, but we need to learn to do our own fight. We don't want to depend on you. This is our struggle. What we need from you are doctors.
Yeah.
We need from you technicians. And if you can give us some artillery pieces, we would welcome that as well. There's some things that you must do on your own. And this is once again, but it's a circuitous argument. It's a cycle, because we have African so-called presidents. Our favorite dictator, for example, Field Marshal Museveni in Uganda, has a Gulfstream jet, which is $50 million. Can you imagine if that $50 million had been donated to the African Union, what it would accomplish? We have all these countries that spend hundreds of millions of dollars on the military. And then on their national days, like Independence Day, they parade these soldiers in the national stadium. They drive by with the tanks You know, that's why all those roads have potholes, because to get to the stadium, they're driving through the streets, right? They drive with armored personnel carriers. They drive with the artillery guns. And all these, by the way, are not used to defend the citizens from foreign invasion. It's used to coerce the domestic population, to keep them in power. But the bigger point is, you never see them parading doctors in the stadium. They never parade engineers, nurses, regular workers. They never do. So the spending, they have their priorities very different. And of course, the priority is not an African Union. And if your priority is not an African Union, your priority is not going to be a United States of Africa. So at the end of the day, I think the strongest thing we have working in our favor are the youth of Africa. It is our task and mission to educate them and transform them. And I'm very hopeful, because every semester, in fact, this semester, I was about to say by the end of the semester, but it's not true.
It just started.
At John Jay, I have taught this semester, each of my 3 classes, 6 lessons. None of them are the same people today. None.
And how long has that been? Since the beginning of the semester.
Yeah, just started. We have had 6 classes, because we have 2 classes per class every week. One student said, "Professor, I'm a high school dropout." And she was almost crying. She almost made me cry too. I've never learned this history in high school. And that's part of the reason I dropped high school. You don't know how happy I am to be in this class. You see? So the point is, if we transform all our young people the same way, African revolution is assured. Because after all, how did Nkrumah become president? When Nkrumah went back to Ghana, after he had spent 10 years studying in the US and Britain, he went back, and I think it was called the United Gold Coast Convention. Correct. The party of the bourgeoisie, the lawyers, the elite, the doctors, who were banging on the British door and not saying independence today. They're banging and saying, "Listen, open the door so I can come into these exclusive."
I'm glad you're bringing that out. Thank you for bringing that out. Thank you.
So they invited Nkrumah, "Please be our Secretary General." Nkrumah did, and he kept urging them, "We need to go to the masses." And they were saying, "No, those people are uneducated. Why are we going to go to them?" Nkrumah said, "Okay, you stay." Nkrumah went and founded his own political party, the Conventional People's Party. Right?
Yeah.
And he went to the masses, and he said, "Independence now." The British locked him up. He was in jail when he was elected, and his party won the election. He was elected to the parliament.
Yeah, he was let out on a technicality.
They had to let him out. So Nkrumah became, as I said earlier, the so-called leader of government business in 1951, and that's when they started monitoring him. So I'm saying, in the same way as Nkrumah went to the people to win independence, we have to go to the youth of Africa to create an effective new African Union and United States of Africa. They have nothing to lose. If they're willing to drown in the Mediterranean because they're running away from desperate conditions, I think they're ready for a United States of Africa.
And I think you've raised a pertinent point there with the example of the school you gave. If you have the information, like Ugugu Ationgo says, decolonizing the mind, and also in his book of essays, Something Torn and New, your memories have been replaced. Imagine if you now replaced those memories with authentic information, which is what you did in your class. Give the people the information. Empower people with the information. You're doing that here. I mean, the people here will take your information elsewhere. Share your videos. Provide them the information. You do the work. Sometimes you cannot be judge, jury, and executioner. Sometimes you just need to be the jury. Provide the information. Somebody else will look on the information and judge it, and somebody will execute.
But as Allimadi talks about the youth, it's not just the youth, Allimadi, it's just Africa in general, the masses, right? I was talking
Yeah,
to
the
my
masses.
mother.
I only say that because the content is
Inspired
so
by the
young,
youth.
and it's so young, you know,
I know
60%
you're inspired by the youth
under
with Bobby
26.
Wine doing all the good work and all the youth in Uganda coming out, right? It's inspiring. But I was having a conversation with my mother the other day. She's back in Kenya. And I was informing her about something that's happening because I'm educating her with every call. I'm just informing her. And she said, Nduku, if not for you saying this to me now, and she said she's going to look into it, I wouldn't know. Because she said to me, we're too busy trying to survive. We don't even know what we're going to eat. So we're caught up in the struggle of trying to survive. And when we're doing that, we can't be worried about any other thing. And this is something that they've done intentionally to keep the people poor and too busy worrying about surviving to rise up. So as we
and uneducated.
and uninformed, right? Because this is me informing my mother. Forget about the education, because this education that we've all been following is miseducation.
Okay.
And I'm glad to hear that there's a Nigerian now in Kenya. Actually, I'm saying that as I point at Adesoji, because he has that Nigerian descent. But there's a Nigerian now in Kenya who has started a freedom school. And I'm happy to hear that. In the spirit of African internationalism, all of us coming together to find a solution.
You mentioned
and that is also good because in some of our countries, they won't allow us to operate.
Right.
If we can do it in another African country.
I cannot wait to go visit this school. Yes. So but when you finish your point, Adesoji, I want to read something quickly to identify the problem, and then we can talk about solutions. But go on.
You identified that your mom said you were still busy struggling to eat.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. When the IMF and the World Bank come into Africa providing any assistance, what's the first two things they attack?
Food production.
And?
Healthcare.
And?
Subsidies for fuel.
So it's usually, go look it up. It's usually food. It's usually food, education, healthcare. So if you're sick and you're worried about your health because you're not eating properly, how can you educate yourself?
It's true. My mother's not worried about people going to school when someone is sick.
There you go. So, I mean, again, it's because you've studied them. That's how you got to know that you can add those three things together and begin to see that they've created the right scenario for it to produce multiple streams of frustrated people that would have no cause but to accept their lot and believe that is the way it has always been. Ayikuyama says it in Remembering a Dismembered Continent. He says most of our leaders come into power, and because they lack imagination, they don't study, they're out of sync with their own very history, which is what Brother Allimadi is doing on a regular basis. They're out of sync with their own very history. They assume that the condition they find themselves in has always been the case. And so what do? They manage. That's it. They manage. So when somebody comes in and says, you know what? You don't need that one. Oh, yeah, you're right. But then your people are then saying, oh, but you do. You don't know any better. So how are you going to push back on it?
Adesoji, I just have to add one thing concerning food. It is utterly criminal. In the U.S., farmers are subsidized to the tune of $30 billion, right? Annually. Think about that.
Let me give you the European picture.
To destroy food, to even dump food, but still have enough income coming from the government. But in African countries, you are penalized if you subsidize your farmers.
In Europe, you are paid not to farm, to keep up the price of the goods in store. And so you're beginning to wonder, you're like, what is going on? And yet, when they come to Africa, the first thing they attack is your food production.
And at the same time, what are they saying? They're saying, let's let the free market operates.
I hate that. I am allergic to that word. I am 100% allergic to
everything works
markets.
out by invisible hands. Well, these invisible hands are giving money to Europeans not to farm and giving money to American farmers to dump food. But they're saying in African countries, if you subsidize, the World Bank will not give you a loan. Remember the famous statement by Malawi's Minister of Finance?
Yeah.
With the Minister of Finance or Agriculture.
Yeah, when he was requested.
They asked him, why was there famine in this country or in particular year? He said, because the World Bank told him they needed to burn the food reserves that they had in storage.
Can you imagine if we went along with it?
And they went along with it in order to get that loan.
We have to awaken from the stupor. Adesoji, as Adesoji is talking about the need to go back into history, I was reading, and today I'm going to be using two writers who, funny enough, what they're writing is similar. But Abdul Rahman Mohammed Babu, whom we've talked about before from Zanzibar, wrote in his proscript in Walter Rodney's book that we recommend all the time, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And he says about this history thing, Dr. Rodney follows the method of historical materialism, which in effect says, to know the present, we must look into the past, and to know the future, we must look into the past and the present. This is a scientific approach. We can at least be sure that the conclusions will not be marred by subjective distortions. And as I say that at Allimadi and Adesoji quickly, I will be, right after the show, I will be reading the proscript. I'm going to go again live on Kumbukeni just to read the proscript because I want you all to hear what he's saying. But go ahead, Allimadi.
It is worth it. I hope people tune in to listen to it. It's a fantastic proscript, Babu. And it's so sad. I think early on we were saying that we don't do enough studying. There's also, even studying is penalized in African countries. Mm. Ironically, the leaders like Nkrumah's generation, they were much more informed than the current crop of leaders, you see, including the ones who are engaged in some of the coups we've seen recently, who are speaking progressive because of what the people are demanding on the streets, but they don't have the kind of knowledge that even a Sankara had, right? Because Sankara, for example, was spotted very early because they used to send a professor to give lectures at the military academies. Mm-hmm. And that professor would give the standard approved lecture by the French neo-colonial establishment. Mm-hmm. But then he would identify some students to come to his home on weekends for extra tutoring.
Because they were asking funny questions.
Exactly.
As he puts it.
And those students, he would teach them on historical materialism.
Yeah.
He would teach them on alternative economic systems, that capitalism is not the only system in the world. And that's how the Sankaras were produced. Mm. But in general, people like Nkrumah, people like Nyerere, all of them could access multiple sources of education. Today, if you go to most of the African higher institutions of learning, they don't teach any radical economics because they're funded by NGOs, they're funded by the World Bank. They're not going to fund any professor who teaches economics that does not embrace neoliberalism. Mm. So there's a huge deficit gap, which is in fact why platforms such as Kumbukeni and the many others who show our youth, and as Sister keeps reminding me, all our people, not just
all our people, because I'm going to be in the fight. Forget you all, brothers. If you all want to sit behind your desks and read.
No, we won't. In fact, it goes back to what Rodney said, remember? Crisis in the periphery, Africa and the Caribbean. He says, he himself, I consider myself part of the elite, part of the problem. So we should be humble enough to ask the people, what do they actually want? What are their solutions? Mm-hmm. Then we can advise them. So I think I'll take the Rodney approach on that respect as well.
So quickly, I'm going to read quickly a paragraph. It's a short paragraph just to identify this problem, and then I'll go into Babu's as we continue the conversation with reading paragraphs here and there. But this writer says, through African internationalism, we were able to reveal the fact that the oppressive conditions faced, and I'm reading this to show the foundation of the AU and the problem therein of the AU and why it must go. we're not even talking about solutions for the AU. We're literally saying it must go. What are we taking on? Right? Because we have identified it's a problem. Through African internationalism, we were able to reveal the fact that the oppressive conditions faced by Africa, Africans and the majority of the peoples of the world are globally connected to the experience of affluence and power by the white population that is dependent on a pedestal of colonial domination. African internationalism connects the current political and economic configuration of the world to the colonial enslavement of Africa and African people. It proves that capitalism emerges as a parasitic world economy born at the expense of Africa, Africans, and all the world's people who are subjected to foreign and alien colonial rule up to this date. And that is a paragraph from this book, The Verdict is in, Reparations Now, by Chairman Omali Yeshiteli. And brothers, what do you think of those thoughts? Thank you. What do you think of those thoughts?
First of all, we should go beyond the white population, but because we have to include with the African non-white partners, because that's very critical as well. And that was part of the genius of so-called independence. When the Europeans were departing the colonies, they designated who would become the leaders. And the problem started, of course, when you have a country like Ghana, where they were not able to designate who would become leader. They were going to designate the party that Nkrumah initially started working for, the United Gold Coast Convention or whatever it was, right? They wanted those elite who were saying, just open the door so we can also come in, to be the new generation of leaders. Sadly, that's what happened in most of the African countries. And that's why we have the white global dominant capital system with the African non-white partners. And that has been the problem since the so-called dawn of independence. We've never really had true independence in African countries, and that's the problem.
Exactly.
So, to buttress that point, when the French ran through Africa and they were looking with Charles Gore, instituting that referendum for independence and tying it to, tying it to the Pact for Continued, or the agreement that is called, otherwise known as the Pact for Continued Colonization. The people he designated were they were called the Evoyers. So meaning they've evolved.
It is so insulting. First of all, how can you as an African, educated, moreover, you see, that's part of the problem with certain types of
you just hit a nerve on Allimadi.
No, think about it. It teaches you to hate yourself and to aspire to be European.
But
and that's supposed to be...
Before even Adesoji finishes, because he hit a nerve on me too.
No. Think about it.
Allimadi.
But the thing is, it worked. It worked.
When I came to the States, I remember seeing white people going to the bathroom barefoot and putting their bags on the floor, on the toilet. You tell me which African in their right mind will do that, so that we talk about civilization.
I mean, so he said, so Evoyer. So the point I was going to make was, there were people who sought their education as a means to liberate their people. And there were people who sought the education as a means to ingratiate themselves in the system. What's his name? Frantz Fanon in his book, Black Skin, White Mask, breaks it down perfectly. And he gives you a category of them, that kind of thing. So the point I'm making with that is, there are so-called Evoyers who decided, we're not going to have anything to do with this system. This system is rotten to the core and it's not going to be inspiring to the African mind. So you're talking about Patrice Lumumba. You're talking about Felix Mwami in Cameroon. Sylvie Olympio in Togo. Modibo Keita in Mali. Sekou Touré in Guinea. But then the flip side of that Evoyer coin is people like Felix Houphouët-Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire.
Speaking of him,
And
when you're finished, I have something.
what's his name? Cheke Diop's countryman, Leopold
Leopold
Senghor,
Senghor.
who said when the agitation for independence was getting close, and they said, "Oh, so now we get to become Africans." Said, "No.
French Africans.
We want no. We want to be black Frenchmen."
Yep.
So these are the kind of guys. I mean, go read his speech. If you read his speech in the resource I provide,
whose speech is this? You said?
Leopold Senghor. He's talking about negritude. That concept of blackness has been poo-pooed on so much so that if you say it now, it's considered an insult. You know, because I mean, everybody from the man himself, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Wole Soyinka, Chinua Achebe, Aiko Yama, basically just rubbish that idea. You're saying you don't recognize yourself, but you only recognize yourself
As
through
a
an
Frenchman.
attitude as
Right.
a Frenchman.
Yeah.
Right. But that concept actually, according to Anta Diop, was bastardized and destroyed. You know, it was coined by Aimé Césaire, right? But if you read his work,
Discourse on
he's
colonialism.
as
Yeah.
radical as they come. So Anta Diop said that term was subsequently bastardized by others who just became accommodationist and talking about
We
you know,
have to get rid of accommodationist. I'm
the
sorry.
poetic romanticism and all that stuff, you know, harking back to the glory days and all that. He said that's not what Césaire meant it to be. He was actually, if you read as his book, you just said, Discourse of
Discourse on colonialism. Yeah.
is very, very radical. And very good, by the way, for people that haven't read the book.
Yeah.
Oh
I
my God.
want to, as you say that, Allimadi, I want to say something for us Africans and realizing that we are in a colonial state still to this day, and realizing that for us to demand and request removal out of that colonial state is to be criminalized. It is to be okay with being criminalized. I want to say that, and now I just lost my thought. Go on, brothers. lost
No,
my thoughts.
I mean, of course you are criminalized because, you know, in order, first of all, what was the whole essence of slavery and colonialism? It was by demonizing the victims, right? So you criminalize the person who is being brutalized,
I just
and you
remembered.
make them the criminal. You know,
Yeah.
you remove their humanity, so you make it easier for other Europeans to say, okay, they should be whipped, they should be castrated, they should be quartered, they should be made to work from sunrise to sundown, right?
Yeah.
They should be worked to death because they're not really human beings. The same thing during colonialism. These are savages. We are delivering to them a higher God, you know, the Christian God, which of course was a commercialized form of spirituality that originated in Africa in the first place, right? But no, we are bringing it back to them to civilize them. And in the course of this civilization, we may have to kill 10 million
Right?
in Congo because they're not producing enough.
The irony of it all, and we're not even questioning it.
So the whole thing of being criminalized, if you're not being criminalized by the system, it means you're not doing the work.
Exactly. But I was going to say, as you were speaking, I remembered it. You said that his writing was radical. We Africans who are seeking to be liberated must be comfortable with the word radical.
Absolutely.
We must be comfortable with the word revolution. We must be comfortable being identified as radical, because that means you are doing something about the situation and seeking your liberation. That's just my approach.
Right. And I mean, to just quickly respond, because it just caught my vision. No, Corey, I agree with you. They knew they were human. They knew they were 100% human. That's why they had to create the propaganda
Exactly.
that they were not human. You know, when you create a propaganda like that, you're negating what you already know. So they, of course, they knew they were human.
I mean, speaking of being devoid, removing humanity from oneself, when Rodney King was beaten up by police in Los Angeles, and the report to the station on the radio was what's going on. The answer from the cops on the scene was no humans involved.
See?
So that goes to show you, and that was 1992. So in a way, in itself, it's when you get statements like, oh, Europe is the garden, Africa is the jungle, and they're trying to get into the garden. That's why they would risk life and limb to swim across in order to get into, what's it called? But here is the thing. If we do not study what it is that is happening around us, and we're constantly being in a reactionary phase, the problem is we would never get to where we need to get to, because there must be people studying, there must be people doing strategy, and then there must be people in the field. Right. You can't have the same people doing everything. You can't split yourself 3 ways. It's practically impossible. I'm pointing to him because the book is on the floor. Thomas Sankara, in his speech, the last one he gave at the Organization of African Unity, July 29, 1987, where he says, when it comes to the issue of how this body operates, taking it back to the AU and Organization of African Unity, when it comes to how this organization operates, we all can decide, one, not to pay our debts, use the funds
we should
to bolster the needs of this organization. And the reason he's saying that is, it's not that the AU didn't used to do it in the past. The AU, in the early, while they were still fighting the apartheid government, gave the ANC 35,000, the PAC 10,000, the PAIGC 145,000, SWAPO 145,000. The Frelimo fighters were given 100,000. Why? Now,
by the way, it was peanuts.
Exactly. No, it was peanuts. Yeah, but here's
at the same time, their countries were spending hundreds of millions of importing weapons.
No, but the problem, the reason I say I gave that ballpark figure was the fact that it was seen as a gesture and an acknowledgement that there is a problem afoot. The liberation movement had to be fought. Nigeria, insert itself to be part of the liberation movement in Southern Africa as one of the frontline states. Nigeria, as a result, lost a leader, Muritala Mohammed, when he pledged the funds of Nigeria to the liberation movement. And also his speech was considered radical or incendiary when he says the neo-colonial powers have refused to understand that, I'm paraphrasing now, they've refused to understand that the Angola has the right to assert its agency of who it does business with and defend itself. If they cannot understand that, then we have to make them understand it. Suffice to say, people like Henry Kissinger were not particularly happy with that statement. And he gave the speech January 12th. February 15th of the same year, he will be dead. So...
No, brother, I agree with you, the sacrifice that Africans made. I mean, there are other examples too. Tanzania, Zambia, they offered training, they offered weapons. They spent a lot more. So those figures were actually small compared to the total contribution they made. And also in the consequences, the price they paid. When Rhodesia used to come and bomb Zambia, they were sabotaging all the way as far as Tanzania. So your point is very well taken. They have shown that they can make sacrifice when they want to in the course of the liberation of Africa. Why are they not making the same sacrifice for the unity of Africa? So I agree with your point 100%.
Yeah, because now, if you notice, the leaders we had then had a sense to speak their mind. But the leaders now, I'll give you an example. We've just talked about it now. One of the most pertinent problems facing Africa is food production. Only 2 months ago, two great leaders in Africa went all the way to Russia to plead with the Russians.
How great are they if they did that? But go on.
To plead with Russia to release grains. And I'm referring now to Zimbabwe and Kenya. William Ruto and Mananagwa, who went all the way to. I mean, you guys are sitting on some of the most fertile land in the world. You're producing flowers for people to profess their love in Europe.
Don't forget the coffee and tea. Very essential.
You know.
Yep. And don't forget the World Bank and IMF in this conversation.
Don't forget that too. And the fact the farmers that cannot hold on to their original seed.
But
the
you know,
GMOs as well.
The scariest thing about what you're saying, Brother Adesoji, is that you can have the land.
But you cannot produce.
Exactly. We can prevent you from growing on the land that you have. Where's the independence?
What
do we mean when we say we have countries that are independent in Africa? We're really abusing the meaning of the word independence.
It is honestly time to play the game, use different strategies, because the ones we've used have not worked.
About it
exactly
in this book. On page 29, I think it is, when it talks about we must not yield our food sovereignty to the outside world. He wrote this in 1965. Today, as you're just pointing out, we're having two African so-called presidents running to Russia and Ukraine, begging for grain. And that, to me, just answer the question. Is there independence in Africa? The answer is a resounding no.
Here, I agree with you, Adesoji, that multiple solutions are needed for this, because multiple problems and multiple ways are being used to keep us subjugated. And I have a lot of descendants of Africans taken from Africa and brought to the United States asking me, what can we do? What can we do? How can we help? I want to invest. If you want to invest, my one solution, it's not the only solution. There never is just one solution. That I suggest is start buying land, get together, come together in cooperatives, start buying land in Africa. We'll figure out what to do with it, but let's start buying it. Let's start buying land everywhere in Africa so that we can take it back, so that we can use it.
Sister, add to this though, because this is something we have to start getting in the mind of everybody. Yes, buy land, but also come to protest against the World Bank and find out what the World Bank and IMF are doing to African countries. I've been contacted many times by comrades about protesting U.S. military bases in Africa and Africa. They do so many well-organized events on that. And I support them, but I'm saying there's actually a bigger enemy to the survival of Africa. And those are those two institutions, the World Bank and the IMF. And I wish that in your organizing efforts, you could also organize campaigns against them.
Yeah.
Because what can be more destructive?
As long as you join me, brother. As long as you join me, or at least you get ready to do a GoFundMe to help me get out of prison when they hold me.
Oh, without a doubt. We got your back, sister. But what can be more destructive than institutions that prevent Africans from growing food, or say you must destroy the food that you have in storage in order for us to give you a loan? You must, and people, please, if you haven't watched this movie, it's a bit documentary, it's a bit dated, but it's very powerful. It's called The End of Poverty, with a question mark, by Diaz, the filmmaker. And it shows how they removed subsidies in Kenya. They were interviewing a Kenyan who lives in the Kibera, in the so-called slum, saying,
oh my God,
we used to be able to go to the clinics, but now you have to pay for any ailment. So now for any ailment we go to the corner store and get aspirin.
You just hit a button for Adesoji. Look at him. He's about to jump off his seat.
No.
Buy aspirin.
That's a very old documentary, but
it's very powerful. They just have to update it.
Oh my God.
As you talk about that, it's funny because as you talk about that, I was anticipating you naming it, because as you were thinking of that, I was thinking, and I know it might not hit the same way on Adesoji, but I was thinking, I recently watched The Spook Who Sat by the Door.
Oh,
and that's all I'm going to say.
The guy was my friend, actually.
That is all I'm going to say.
But I used to communicate
with him. It's on YouTube. Go watch it, and then you have a brilliant mind. You have logic in your head. You want solutions. Go watch it.
Yeah. The guy just passed away a few years ago.
And when you said The End of Poverty, it reminds me of The Lords of Poverty by Graham Hancock, the book.
Yes.
Where he talks about, you said earlier that the NGOs will come in hoping to be your best friend. He gives a very good breakdown of what the roles of the NGOs are in Africa. And what's his name? In a letter that the CIA wrote about Nkrumah's book, which is a letter I will enjoin people to actually download to read for themselves, which is titled Book Review, Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. This book. In there, it says, I will enjoin the director to focus on chapter 18, the mechanism of neocolonialism, page 239 to 254, is the one which most caught the eye of the press and is of greatest interest to the CIA. Here, Nkrumah explains how the imperialist power achieved their modern objectives, which they formerly achieved by naked colonialism, but now by neocolonialism. And he cites the US as the worst offender, in Nkrumah's opinion, utilizing the extended tentacles of Wall Street, the World Bank. Oh my God. When I was reading the letter alone, I said, you know what?
Yeah. No,
That's
think about it. By the way, his name was Sam Greenlee. I was trying to remember his name. Sam Greenlee, who is the author of that, the book, The Spook. And also is a film, by the way. I think it may be on YouTube.
It's on YouTube, yeah.
But in terms of Nkrumah, what he said, and he wrote in the book, of course, that ultimately contributed to them overthrowing him.
Of course.
Because as we've discussed on previous shows,
it was too much.
They wrote an official protest. A country writing an official protest to another country, whose president just published a book, protesting over the book. And they cut off $25 million.
Whiners. They are truly such babies, these colonialists.
And talk about freedom of speech. Freedom of thought, freedom of information. But they cut off $25 million at that time, which
for
in today's term is almost $300 million equivalent. So that's a significant chunk of money because of this book. So, sisters and brothers, it's worth ordering this book.
If
Nkrumah paid the price just for publishing a book.
If nothing else, go support the brother. But you know what? We got so caught up in this conversation. And for those of you who think we didn't talk about the African Union, go rewatch and then reflect. But
but we need to, before we finish, sister, we said we are going to offer some suggestions.
Yes,
what is to be done.
But before we do, we forgot, we got so caught up, it's 1:13. So let's keep that in mind so that we can look at a few questions. But yes, solutions, please.
All right. I just have one suggestion. The African Union concept was first discussed in a meeting in Sirte, Libya, and came up with the Sirte Declaration on September 9, 1999. It was formally launched on July the 9th, 2002 in Durban, South Africa. I think on the next anniversary, July 9, 2024, we should host a virtual African Union, what is to be done conversation. We should start inviting submissions, extracts of proposed papers to be discussed.
Well, just put it out now. Put it out there now. Yeah.
So people start sending it to us. Let's give them our email, and we'll start planning.
Yeah. The email is kumbukeni1@gmail.com. You all know the same name we have here.
People can join from anywhere in the world, and we'll have that conversation. And we will ask people to identify their affiliation. Because what we want to avoid is this. The conversation over African Union is a conversation of the elite of African presidents and African ministers of foreign affairs, right? We want, yes, of course, academics. We want political leaders. We want farmers, we want students, we want a diversity of social strata, not just having the elite in this conversation, so that we'll have a diversity of viewpoints when we have this virtual conversation. So that would be my suggestion.
Adesoji, what's your solution or solutions? Because you have multiple.
So the first thing is political consciousness has to be awoken.
True.
We're far too caught up with headlines that, excuse me. I mean, it's okay for people to provide 5-second sound bites on YouTube and send them around, but you have to also provide context, understanding, point people in terms of resources, and not just sometimes, screaming on screen. and garnering what's the word, going viral.
Yeah,
Not
and
not that
getting
screaming. And here goes you and talking about multiple solutions. Screaming is a solution as well. So go ahead.
So when I say screaming, I don't mean
No, but being angry and putting out that anger so
Yeah,
that you
yeah,
can empower people is a solution. Go ahead,
it's
brother.
fine. But I insist that scream and give us solutions to our
Thank you.
exactly.
and
There
it's
you
not
go.
very difficult to do that.
Thank you.
Exactly.
There's
No,
a certain
that's why I
there's a
qualified
certain
them.
professor,
Thank you.
and I won't name him because I don't want people to think like I'm a hater.
You.
But he has like a big following, but he never offers solutions, and that is not good.
Mm,
So
Exactly.
you people who admire him tremendously, when you
mm.
inbox him once in a while and you make comments on his videos, please
Ask
ask
him.
him to provide solutions. That's
Does he respond to emails?
I don't know. I haven't tried to
Does he look
communicate
at
with him.
them?
In fact,
Adesoji.
I've only commented once because he said something which is a major contradiction. But that's the only time I did.
I
But
just
my main point is please offer solutions. Don't get used to just liking to hear the sound of your voice, is what I'm saying.
put it this way: anytime he comes across my timeline, just swipe.
Oh my God.
Because if I need to know what, it's not a shade on him, but he's not saying it.
Shame on you.
He's not saying anything.
Look at
it.
him
So
telling you shame on you after he just said what he said. But your solution,
I just swipe.
we
So
took
yeah.
you away from your solution.
So first things first is political consciousness. You have to first of all get the people conscious as to what they're facing. I mean, they know what they're facing, but sometimes they need words to articulate. They need to articulate them in words, not just be angry. You need to say, okay, listen, last year I had £5 in my pocket, and this year I only have 2. Why is that the case? Is it due to inflation? Yet I still have the same £5, but I can't buy anything with the same amount as yet. So you need to have that way of thinking, and that kind of. So political consciousness is one. Then 2 is the fact that all politics is local
and international at the same time. But go on.
It's local first. And when I say it's local first, if you throw a stone into a pond, the ripple starts from the center. So that center is your local. Yes, the people at the edges will feel it, but the person at the center will feel it first. So get people like Brother Milton said, you need papers. Get them to articulate what is it about you in Kenya that makes you unique or makes you different from the person in Tanzania, which is just across the river, or or what makes you unique from the person at the top in Ethiopia. That again, the moment you're able to articulate that and have the political consciousness enough to articulate it, you're on the path to understanding the solutions. Once you could articulate your problem, solutions is just like, just starts coming in. So those 2 are mine. AU is a vehicle.
Yeah.
Is it past?
We're about to ditch that vehicle and buy a new one.
Is it past its sell-by date?
Way past.
Some will argue yes. Some will say, well, it's on life support. Give it a couple of months, and let's see whether it will, get up and walk.
Did you see what the French did with the vehicles in West Africa? What was that country they left? In Mali?
Yeah, but that's their property.
No, that's what I'm going to do to the AU. But go on.
Yeah, but that's their property. They can destroy their property if they want to.
I think any organization is as good as its members and its leadership, and it can't go beyond that. You cannot be what you're not. AU equals the people who are currently running African countries, and we need to find a vehicle to make it difficult for AU to behave the way the misrulers are behaving.
Well, they'll not be existent, so
absolutely,
we don't have to worry about how they behave. We're taking them out. My solutions, 2 of them, not all the solutions. I'm always learning and growing and coming up with solutions. But right now, in this moment, as Adesoji tells me to focus on local politics, on November 4th, we're going to be marching on the White House. And I'm going to put the link there, and you can join us and let your voice be heard. Because we are going to disrupt the colonial system. It's going to be an anti-colonial march. It's going to be Black people. It's going to be indigenous peoples. It's going to be Cubans. It's going to be all kinds of oppressed people. My other solution is in me reading the postscript written by Abdul Rahman Mohammed Babu on how Europe underdeveloped Africa, and he will give you the answers there because he does have them. So join me 10 minutes after this show and we'll go live and I'll be reading that.
And I would like to add to what the sister just said. Abdurrahman Mohammed Babu is not as well known as Walter Rodney, for example, because Rodney was affiliated with, well, Rodney became very famous, particularly after, sometimes when they do something bad, it really actually elevates you. Okay. So, for example, when he was expelled from Jamaica, he was already pretty much renowned by then, but he actually even just raised his stature much, much more. And then, of course, he participated in the conference of Black writers in Toronto, in Canada. And that's where he was when he was told not to come back to the country. But the point I'm making is that Abdurrahman Mohammed Babu should be as well known as Rodney. And of course, Rodney published many more books, and that is why he's much better known. But I highly, highly recommend Mohammed Babu's The Future That Works. Please, please, please order that book. I know that he spoke around the world, and whoever has his papers, I think they should publish more titles under his name, and people will see what I mean. The collection of essays in that book that Adesoji just held up, just unbelievable, really spot on point.
And maybe we'll go looking for them because we do plan to take about 20 people for an East African trip in 2025. And those of you who know me, those of you who are connected to me will find out more as we continue to plan.
Yes, please.
But this is going to be part of it, digging up the history of East Africa, the slave trade there that is not spoken of often, but going to Dar es Salaam to get Walter Rodney's and all the revolutionaries' information there. And maybe we will go looking for Babu's papers when we visit. Yeah. As you can see, I'm trying my best to put some, and if you want to speak on this is by U Akata.
I agree totally. I wrote a couple of
I'm going to continue looking for more
essays on the removal of Berlin Conference names. I wrote about why Lake Victoria and Victoria Falls should be renamed. I did an article on Black Star. I did an article, I think, on Medium. I did an article for the Zimbabwe Herald. I did an article on Sahara Reporters on that particular issue. So I agree 100%. You cannot be decolonized when you're celebrating those colonial names.
True. And Babu in actually The Future That Works, he said the only reason why the AU did not celebrate the 100-year anniversary of the Berlin Conference in 1984 was because they were ashamed to confront the fact that in 84 nothing really has changed.
Right.
And so in 2023, the same question can still be posed and the same position can still be held, that nothing has changed. And so how do you go back to the people to remind them that they're independent where they can't feel any aspect of said independence? Again, that is in the China chapter, The Africa We Need. And so if you get the book, it's all in there.
So speak a bit about, as Madujibe is talking about the US bases in Africa, let's speak a bit about that, please.
There are no independence in Europe for that matter. Is it Europe or Africa?
He's saying even in Europe, even in the United States, colonized.
There's a difference. There's a difference in the sense that they have embraced each other as a fellow European global community. And what do I mean by that? After the destruction of Europe, World War II, they were beneficiaries of the Marshall Plan project. Billions of dollars, not as a loan, as a grant, free money that restored and recovered their economy. Yet Africans contributed millions of soldiers to fight But that money did not go to restore their countries because, number one, they were still colonies. So the money given was being given to Europeans and their colonies. But of course, they didn't use the money in the colonies. They only used it in continental Europe. So it's different when you have US bases basically in a fellow European global community.
Germany.
They develop economically together at the expense of Africa. You see? So I'm sure they are not as resentful as having. In fact, many of them invited the US forces because to them the existential threat was coming from the former Soviet Union. On that basis, that relationship was established. But Africa is abandoned economically, totally, to its own ends.
Adesoji, anything on this?
Yes, with regards to the basis, basically, Africa is surrounded by, unfortunately, about 6 to 7 naval bases. I don't want to name them, but everybody, I mean, just look them up.
They're more than that, but go on.
No, they're 6. There's 6.
And naval bases, and then there are other bases.
I was about to say, I think just West Africa.
I'm saying naval bases. There are 6.
All right. Okay.
Right.
Military bases on the land. There are, from the 1960s up till now, there are about, let's give us you can't quote me on this, but
more than the number of African countries.
Suffice to say,
you know what?
I
never even thought about it that way, Allimadi. When you think about it that way,
in some countries they have
multiple.
They have multiple. Like Djibouti has basically a base for every of those European powers. South
Kenya
Africa
has at least 3. There's 2 in Mombasa.
But those bases, I insist, are just the symptoms of weakness.
Exactly.
If we can deal with the World Bank and allow Africa to develop independent economies, those bases would go so quickly because they would be empowered and they would come one day and just show up in front of the base and say, it's time to go.
That's it.
But when you are hungry, dependent, you're sick, you're uneducated.
There you go. You probably think they're your friends.
We have great suggestions in the chat, brothers. I urge you to go and look later and see what they're suggesting. I took down some notes on topics suggested. We'll look into those. I responded. I don't know if both of you can look quickly to see if there's any question I'm missing that you'd like to speak on, that we have time to speak on.
US did coups in 1960 against European countries that did not go along with the capitally. No. Yes.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, there was the coup in Portugal. There was although the coup in Portugal, would I say
they undermined democracy in Greece.
Greece, yes.
There's a friend who points out that the assassination of US presidents are coups. We just don't call them that, but they take them out and then they put in whoever they want.
True.
Yeah, but you still have the vice president, isn't it? So,
no, but the government of the United States, through its different factions, kills its leaders and then puts in who they want.
It's true. But here's the thing. In the U.S., the system is still capital.
The system. Exactly.
So individuals can do only so much. So that's why I don't really understand when I hear sister and brothers saying, oh, Obama didn't do the S word for Black people. Obama is the driver in the seat of an empire. And the driver cannot do that much in an empire like this, an empire on autopilot, an empire ruled by capital, right? In fact, I think Michel was just very happy that he was able to complete 2 terms, alive, you see?
That's it.
We have a system here. So that's why we make a mistake when we look at individuals. We have to go after the system of rapacious and controlled capitalism, which is concentrating even much more wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands. And of course, go ahead.
The illusion is, he's the president and commander-in-chief. Of what?
In title. In name.
Quickly, as we talk about the commander in chief, quickly respond to this one. I don't know myself if they're going to form a federation.
That is a challenge that
I hope that they don't do it in the current colonial state that they still are in. So
no, that's the beginning. In fact, that's what Anta Diop insisted. Let's start with the political unity.
Yeah,
without
and he
that,
did suggest we start with small and then expand.
Right. So that would be this question right here. Niger.
They use it. Funny enough, it is them going back to their history. There used to be a federation of the
which was even bigger.
Which was even bigger than this.
Yeah. And that's when the French came and chopped it up.
Exactly.
So maybe we talk about that in a show coming soon. Maybe next week. Maybe another.
Is right. They're going back to their
history
formats. When they were cohesive, united empires, very powerful empires.
But just I said that about next week, and I forgot that next week we're going to be covering Mama Winnie Madikizela Mandela, which I'm very excited about, brothers, because her birthday is the following week on Tuesday. She doesn't get the love that she deserves as much internationally from international Africans, and we're going to give it to her on Sunday, or at least as much as we can, the three of us. Go on, Allimadi.
Well, I was just saying my siblings, I normally get occasions on a WhatsApp chat with them. I think they're waiting for me now.
All right.
So I have to say adieu.
Kwaheri to everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Adesoji, closing words.
Yes. Like Thomas Sankara says, a soldier without a political ideology is nothing but a bandit. So we should be careful with some of these military leaders. But hopefully, in the words of Nkrumah, Africa unites or it perishes. So it's one of those things. So
my last words is the colonial system. That's what we're going for. Stop with the small fights. We're going for the colonial system because we cannot build within it. As if you build a location in Africa, a location in Jamaica, a location wherever, as long as there's colonial system seeing you doing that and controlling us, they will take you down. You will never find happiness. So I look forward to everyone joining me again. November 4th, we're going to be in DC. Those of you who want to join us, if you cannot join us, there will be virtual options and you can support financially. So just use the link that I put there. And thank you all for coming. Kwaherini. I'm going to get back on in 5 minutes or less to read the postscript by Abdul Rahman Mohammed Babu on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Have a good day, everyone.